On Tuesday, the House committee investigating the January 6th attack held its seventh public hearing. They charged that President Trump planned in advance to call on his supporters to march on the Capitol, but wanted it to seem impromptu. We heard a salvo of sound bites about an unhinged Oval Office meeting that include discussions of declaring martial law and the federal government seizing voting machines. Since that hearing came news from a government watchdog that the Secret Service deleted text messages from January 5th and 6th of 2021. Joining us now to discuss this is Luke Broadwater, congressional reporter for the New York Times, my colleague there in the halls on the Hill. Luke, thank you so much for joining us with our panel here. Hey, I want to start with you in sort of a question about thinking about the narrative arc of this committee over 7 hearings so far. What do you think they were trying to connect? What dots were they trying to connect this week?
Sure. I think if you look at each of the hearings and sort of as a big picture, if you step back, they suggest almost every time a different avenue of wrongdoing by President Trump. If you look at some of the earlier hearings, they were suggesting the fake elector scheme as a matter for investigation. They were suggesting obstructing an official proceeding of Congress. They were suggesting defrauding the American people and even his own donors. And so I think what we're going to see at this next hearing is a lot of talk about dereliction of duty. And that could potentially have legal implications, but it definitely has ethical and political implications for the former president. And so each of these hearings is a different avenue that the January 6th committee is suggesting, not only to the public, but also to the Justice Department, that this is an area to investigate. And here are a lot of details and facts that present a pretty damning case against the former president.
Tarina, can you help us with that? The Department of Justice, what do we know about where they are and where other investigations are in terms of possible criminal charges for the Trump administration and those right around it?
Well, we know that Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, is under increasing pressure to do something. With every hearing, we're seeing more and more evidence. As you said, the committee has been connecting a lot of dots here. And so it's been putting pressure on Justice Department officials to do something. Most recently, we also heard from Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who brought up another potential evidence or instance of witness tampering. And she said that they referred that case to the Department of Justice. So they're starting to share more information now between the committee and the Department of Justice. And so we'll see how the Department of Justice is able to build a case, whether or not they're able to do that. But they certainly are under a lot of pressure right now.
Hans, speaking of someone sharing more information, Pat Cipollone sat for 8 hours with the committee behind closed doors last week, and we saw a video of his testimony this week. How significant of a figure is the former White House counsel in all of this?
Oh, I think he's providing an enormous amount of intelligence and insight on what was happening on those days leading up to and the day of January 6th. And, there's a question on whether or not he was going to testify, whether or not he was going to invoke executive privilege. And Luke might be in a better position to sort of adjudicate on what's new and what we've learned, but it seems like a lot of the facts that are out there on January 6th, we've kind of known through some great reporting from the Times, from Axios, from the Wall Street Journal. But what they're doing is they're really sort of tying it all together. And I liked how he talked about different avenues on different sort of and different sort of lines of attack on the president, if that's the right way to put it. And I think the big question is, how much are we learning new things, or are they proving things that we already knew? And to me, it seems like more of the latter, but I'd be curious on what everyone else has to say.
I am going to ask you, Luke, because I have a feeling you might actually dispute that, despite, I know, the tremendous amount of work the New York Times has done on this issue. Are we hearing new things?
Well, we are. I do agree with Hans that probably 80–90% of each hearing has been reported. I mean, January 6th, the American press corps, I think, has done a phenomenal job investigating January 6th. I mean, you have some great books that have been written. You've got sort of all-star teams at all the major outlets that are digging into this nonstop. And yet each hearing, they surprise me with something. Yeah. There'll be some text message I've never seen, or some deposition I've never heard before. And so, I think we learned for the first time at these hearings about the names of specific Congress members who had allegedly sought pardons. We'd heard that Rudy Giuliani or Mark Meadows had allegedly sought pardons. You hear about allegations of witness tampering that we didn't know about. So I do think each hearing does present new evidence. The thing that really stuck out to me from the last hearing was the text messages with the rally planners, where they were having these sort of private conversations about, we're going to have this second secret rally near the Capitol, but it's got to be, we can't let people know about it. It's got to appear unexpected. And I think that was some new evidence we hadn't heard before about people trying to keep these plans to bring the crowds to the Capitol quiet.
I also think that, it's one thing to report these things, but a lot of, as we learned in 2016, when, a lot of reporters are covering later President Donald Trump, a lot of people aren't reading what we're reporting. So it's one thing to actually put it in print, and then another to see it in a committee hearing and really, have that message get across to the people. I mean, some of these hearings have gotten pretty decent ratings, so I'd say there's a little bit of a difference on that front.
I think it's a great point, are these breaking through to the public? And I think the people that really have the best sort of antenna on that are Republicans who are nervous that this is going to affect their attempt to take over the House and Senate. And from Republicans privately, you hear that these hearings have done a decent job, a fairly good job, exposing what Democrats say was a dereliction of duty, potential, insurrection, all the different verbs and nouns that we hear. Republicans are the ones that are saying, I think this committee's breaking through. And I'm sure you've both been picking this up as well. You talk to as many Republicans as I do when you're on the Hill.
No, it's true. They went into this thinking they didn't need a strategy. Their strategy was no strategy. We're going to ignore it. But that has backfired. And I think part of it, some of you have observed too, is that many of the witnesses have been Republicans. I want to talk about a different Republican. Republican on the committee, Liz Cheney, the vice chairman of the committee, ended the proceedings by teasing what you mentioned earlier, Tarini, sort of a bombshell. Let's play this bite.
Tried to call a witness in our investigation. That person declined to answer or respond to President Trump's call. Their lawyer alerted us, and this committee has supplied that information to the Department of Justice.
Now, this was a fascinating moment in the hearing room, not just because, of course, this was a potential criminal charge, as you're talking about, Tarini, but it was Liz Cheney bringing it up at the very end, sort of mentioning it, and I don't think most of the committee members knew she was going to do it. And I want to ask Luke, I have reported on this, but I'm interested in your reporting on Liz Cheney's role, because I understand behind the scenes, she's very assertive. She is really pushing the committee, but what is your reporting on that?
Yeah, I would say Liz Cheney is the most powerful behind-the-scenes driving force on the committee. Everybody I talk to says, we've got some very aggressive Democrats on this committee, people who are known as very fierce fighters against Donald Trump. That's sort of the reputation. And all of them say Liz Cheney is tougher and more aggressive than we are behind the scenes. And Liz Cheney also, because of her role with the so-called Gold Team, which is the team investigating Donald Trump, she's been sort of overseeing that team. And so she has access to some of these depositions and interviews that other members and staff don't necessarily have. And sometimes I hear from staffers who are completely surprised by something Liz Cheney will bring out at the last minute. But that's part of the, I think, the success and the drama of these hearings is they do have teasers and they have cliffhangers. And so they've embraced the sort of elements of television that are not normally present in a Capitol Hill hearing. And that's why I think that they're getting something like, an average of 14 million viewers for these hearings, which I think is unheard of for your normal congressional hearing.
Certainly the impeachment hearings did not have this kind of drama, though the stakes were really just as high. I want to ask all of you, just in our parting minutes here, I've said, you've probably said on panels before, no one thinks that these will really impact the midterms, these hearings necessarily. We'll see. But I want to ask each of you, could this affect something bigger in terms of how Americans see what happened, how Americans decide they should act themselves and their neighbors? Hans.
So it's an interesting sort of public policy, public perception question. I suspect the most lasting impact of these hearings are whether or not they're going to result in criminal referrals and whether or not the Department of Justice will decide to indict the former president and prevent him from running in 2024. And that is no small decision for any attorney general to make. So to me, that's the big question. So are there criminal referrals and does the Justice Department act on them? And I don't have the answer to that.
Luke?
The criminal referral discussion, the committee's postponed until they release their report in September. It does seem like most people I talk to on the committee think that referrals are a good idea. There are some holdouts and skeptics that they don't want to look like they're unduly influencing the Justice Department, and any charges against Trump and his allies should seem like they're unaffected by politics. But the committee at this point has done so much publicly calling for a Justice Department investigation. I don't know how you sort of put that genie back in the box. I mean, they've said Merrick Garland, do your job, and Adam Schiff was just on TV criticizing the slowness of the Justice Department's investigation. So they've been pretty open about what they want the Justice Department to do.
Tarini, I want to ask you in our last minute. We love tangible things like criminal charges, but I want to ask you a big picture question too.
Yeah.
Can this move anyone's psyche or culture here?
Yeah, I think, we always think of things politically, and, in the midterms, it's because the economy is on everyone's minds. It's not going to move things. But I think looking ahead to 2024 and how people sort of think about government and the presidency, it might again raise questions about sort of the chaotic time that we went through during the Trump presidency, and sort of remind people of that and whether they want to see that again, given that he might be announcing sometime in the fall. I don't know if, philosophically or culturally it'll change much, but maybe, politically looking ahead to 2024, it could have a little bit of impact.
I think it could affect the idea that the election was stolen, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you all. We could talk about this so long. We appreciate it. Tarini, Hans, Luke, thank you all so much for joining us. A really good discussion tonight.